Hello, welcome to Age Policy. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin. This is our week in review where we go over the previous episodes and discuss what has happened over the previous week and any comments and ideas. And Charlene kind of asks questions based on what was put out, and we have a more freewheeling discussion. I have no idea what's going to be asked or how this will proceed. One quick thing, there is some work going on around the studio, so if you do hear some background noise, I apologize ahead of time. We're Stoic philosophy, beyond our control, unfortunately.
Yes, beyond our control. We're going to make the most of it. This week has been interesting. I know you talked about the US election. A lot of people are keen to hear what you have to say, and especially myself, because I'm not really familiar with US politics. I think it's very complicated compared to Australian politics. Just the way of like how each state organizes itself, and I mean they work like their own countries, and you have to understand the values and the types of people that live in these states and get enough seats. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
For each state?
So this is a really important subject where the massive size and diversity of the United States. Okay. So it has 340 odd million people, 50 different states, and it's not like many other countries where, like in Australia, we have a vast landmass, and there are some sort of regional variations between places, but you definitely feel like you're in the same country no matter where you are, right? Whereas in the United States, the culture between Utah and Louisiana and Maine and California and Florida, like these places are so different that they are very much their own culture and society. And that the United States is sort of a strange confederation of independent, quite separate entities. Okay, so they already fought a massive civil war, wherein the Union fought to preserve the federation effectively of these different states, while the Confederacy sought to separate itself into more like-minded entities, right? So putting aside any of the reasons or wherefores of the conflict, it goes to show how disparate and different these groups are and how uneasy the alliance is among these different groups, united only by the most basic common denominator and even some contestation over that as well. So when someone says, for example, oh, the Democrats are destroying America or the Republicans are destroying America, their idea of what America is what they're talking about, not the actual country itself, right? So in Australia, you have these elections where, like, you could be a Labor voter or a Greens voter or a Liberal voter. People in your household could be different to you. People in your workplace will be different to you. And there's really no tension created as a consequence of that at all, right? Like it's such a non-issue. And we have people voting across the political spectrum in basically every electorate. You have some safe seats and some kind of, contested seats. But by and large, you'll have Labor and Liberal voters across the board, right? Whereas in the United States, that's not the case. For the vast majority of Americans, you're exposed to one political party your whole life, okay? Because in your home state, that's probably very red or very blue, okay? And what happens is the party apparatus recruits from among those people. And then all the fundraising, because a lot of money in American politics, right? All the fundraising is within those home states. And then they go and spend all the money in these battleground states that they don't really understand, of which there's only about 12, okay? So most Americans, they grow up in a one-party system, okay, where they've a lot of people in, California, New York City have never met a Republican and vice versa in Texas, right?
So it's not balanced at all.
There's not at all. And that's why, for example, Hillary Clinton was caught at a New York City fundraiser calling all of Trump's voters a basket of deplorables, racist, xenophobic, Islamophobic, etc. Because all of those donors in the room, they've never met a Trump voter, really. They just assume that this is the way Republicans are. There's a mutual loathing. And this has changed dramatically. This is one of the great deteriorations of American society, and one of the things that could actually upend it, one of the contributing factors. So, for example, in the 1960s, there was a massive study done, okay, where everyone was asked, hey, how would you feel if your son or daughter married a member of the opposite political party? Now, in the 1960s, no one in America had ever thought of the question. They're just like, oh, yeah, fine. We have dinner every night. Politics is discussed. It'd be good to have a few more viewpoints, etc. Right?
Yeah, get challenged.
Yeah, exactly. People were very positive about that, okay?
Yeah.
And so less than 5% of people responded negatively. It was like, yeah, whatever, right? In the US today, as of a couple of years ago, over 40% of respondees said that they would have serious personal grievances, particularly on the Democratic side, serious personal grievances if their son or daughter married across party lines, okay? That was higher than race, religion, any other form of question was political allegiance, okay? So people, what that means is that people have the same kind of attachment to their old party as they always have, okay? But their view of the opposing party is now starkly negative. They no longer see them as people with positive kind of hopes for the future of the country, just with different ideas, but actually malicious actors who are intrinsically evil and malign actors against the nation, okay? So this is really fragmenting, this hyper-partisanship is fragmenting American life in a way that isn't happening in Australia, for example. So it is one clear distinction between the American culture and Australian culture and the cohesion of their national society. It's even more worrying a bit than that in some ways, because the media landscape reinforces it. So it's highly partisan, highly separate. This is true in Australia, but less powerful. And of course, the focus of money is a big issue in the United States, and who can donate and how, and these rules and registration rules and all this gerrymandering, all of that is reinforcing this pre-existing problem. Now, what the way in which America has historically gotten over this is kind of being played out again with China, right? So one of the dimensions of China is what it's doing for the United States in trying to hold America together. Okay, so during World War II and after World War II, in the 1960s when this survey took place, almost everyone in Congress was a veteran. Okay, right? Because what happens is they got a free education when they came back to the United States as part of their New Deal under Roosevelt. Returning veterans got their education paid for. They get their education, they run for office, they get elected, and then in the 1960s, they're all veterans, and they all know each other from the war, right? So, okay, so-and-so might be a Republican, but that doesn't mean anything to me, right? What matters is to me that he was in the 101st, okay? That's what matters, okay? And so the uniformity of the nation, right, despite the massive diversity demographically, and of course those shifts are even greater now, was held together by the shared national experience and struggle, right? That greatest generation experience of the Great Depression and the war was something that they could all rally around, right?
Can this virus be that?
Well, we thought so for a fleeting moment, right? There was that moment where, as someone said, when you have real problems, you stop talking about the imaginary ones, right? And that if we all had the shared human experience of a virus that stopped the world economy and we're all suffering through, that we would bring us all together. But no, instead we have the revenge with an absolute avalanche of the intersectional ideologies, the radical extreme left, extreme right ideologies, the inverse masochistic form of racial kind of groups and so on, like the reinvention of language and ideas, the rejection of Enlightenment principles. These things are all happening at the same time as the pandemic. It's like, it's the absurdity of having mass protests at a time when you have a pandemic, and the media will
social distance.
yeah, exactly. These things are happening at the same time. So no, it's not actually solving as that brief moment where we thought we could actually unify about this. No, that's not possible. What is more unifying, and probably the only unifying factor, is, as I said, China, right? So, the US and the American people rallied around the struggle against Japan and against Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And then that kept the country together for decades thereafter. The struggle against China, which is across party lines, will also be one unifying force for the United States. So in some ways, America needs this struggle, right? And it's an observation that won't be talked about too much or thought of too much. But one thing the Chinese need to understand is that a reason why the Americans won't withdraw, even if the costs to the United States seem absurdly high to maintain this geopolitical competition, the Americans will, because the cost of not having that external adversary to unify everybody is such that that those pressure cooker elements that are already tearing America apart could actually explode. And so, it's extremely helpful to America in some ways that China exists and is this autocratic dictatorship, because it is something that Americans across the board, at least in principle, even if you have an increasingly authoritarian left, at least in principle, stand up against.
Yeah, I think China could be a good wake-up call for America that you need each other. We need each other, or Western society. Interesting. And then we also, kind of roundabout way, but you talked about the US election and how you're still unsure. And I have no prediction because I don't understand US politics too well. But I just know that if we had a vaccine before the election, then Trump would definitely win. In my opinion, I don't know. Because he could just use it to his advantage, right? When you're in power, you can attribute everything that happens.
Oh, of course. If there was a vaccine, particularly if it was developed within the United States and it was effective and it was distributed before the November election, then Trump would win hands down. But that's not going to happen. So one of the I am somewhat familiar with clinical trials. One of my I don't talk about my government work at all, but in a previous life, not stuff that I'm doing now, I was responsible for clinical trials in Australia, largely. And
there's multiple stages, right?
Yes. So the first stage is basically you test it on healthy subjects, not for effectiveness or anything like that, but just to stress test it for potential toxicity, right? And often under controlled conditions, you basically create a situation in which you do get some kind of reaction to see what level of dosages an average healthy human adult can withstand before there's an adverse reaction, right? And that is it is completely distinct from the properties of the therapy itself, purely to decide, okay, well, let's say you get at 100 milligrams a slight headache. Well, then the maximum allowable dosage of that product might be 1/4 of that. Okay, and then they'll extend that trial out in various ways, and then it's not until you get to the double-blind clinical trials, phase 3 trials, that you actually really start rigorously testing for its effectiveness in treating the disease. And then that mass trial, which will involve many, many more people, will also give you greater information as to the health dangers and risks that wouldn't have been picked up in earlier trials. So that's the longest, biggest, most difficult process.
Yeah.
And it is completely something you can't skip over. I mean, I know the Trump administration is like, well, the urgency and importance of this is such that we'll take additional risks and shortcuts. No, that's just not how this process works. It's not how science works. And the consequences of getting that wrong. I mean, imagine, if a vaccine was released to the public that was actually harmful, Trump wouldn't just lose. He could actually, spend the rest of his life in prison. I mean, which I don't think, it's not going to go there. So the answer is, yes, there is a global race to get a vaccine up and running. And the modalities of that vaccine will vary across the world. But first of all, it's not even clear that we'll get one. We don't have one for other forms of coronaviruses. If we do get one, we don't know how easy it'll be to produce.
Yeah.
We don't know how expensive it'll be. We don't know how long-lasting the effects will be, and we don't know the degree of its efficacy. So people who are putting all their hopes in the vaccine basket are not living in accordance to Stoic precepts, put it that way.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I just think to myself, like, oh, if we did have a vaccine, and just imagine the propriety issues. That is definitely like, taking power. So there is going to be an election, obviously, between Trump and Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm.
What really stood out to me in your discussion was why we Americans might be reluctant to vote for Joe Biden. And as a young person, I looked up his age, and he's 77. He's 77 years old. And it kind of makes me think, is this person capable to be a leader? And what is a capable leader? In terms of, their cognitive ability, will he be around? Does he understand what the next generation will be able to deal with? Depends who he's consulting with, because I don't know, in my perspective, what you put out was his party is monitoring him, right? Is he a puppet? Like, that just sounds like, that's my impression. I don't know.
Yes. Well, he reminds me of a lot of the papal elections. So one of the weird areas of knowledge that I have is in Vatican politics, right? So I'm not a career like Vatican official or anything, but I did live at the Vatican for a while in the context of doing research. And I got to understand the bureaucracy, right? Very, very well. Very old bureaucracy, very rigid. And one of the techniques that a lot of cardinals do when voting for the next pope is to vote for people older than themselves. First of all, because it increases the possibility that they will have the opportunity to be pope themselves, because if the older person dies, then they will be able to participate in future elections. And also, it's often a safer pair of hands perceived, because they're not, older people don't have the energy, the drive, the will to change. And
isn't that what we need?
You'd think so. And that is it, right? Biden just looks like somebody's puppet,
Yeah.
And his personal intrinsic motivation for being president of the United States is that he isn't Trump. That's his motivation.
That's a terrible argument.
And that's what he's got. Okay. And then some people will vote for him because they too don't like Trump, and some people will vote for him because they're worried about the Supreme Court. Okay. So one of the things that are that is interesting about the American Republic is that in times of the weakness of the presidency and Congress, the Supreme Court becomes the most powerful arm of government, right? Because their appointees are appointed for life, they have life tenure, and they have enormous constitutional power to rule over the laws of the land and what they mean. And we've been seeing some very interesting decisions. There's one where just recently, now I want to separate the legal, before I comment on this, separate the legal decision from the ethics of it, right? The challenge was that sexuality and transgenderism should be a protected characteristic under the Civil Rights Act, so that you can't get fired for being transgender, right? And now, that legislation was passed in the 1960s as a consequence of the Martin Luther King, the John Lewis's of the world, who said, look, based on your race, you can't be fired, right?
Yeah.
And that was part of that whole movement. Now, the language around that is very clear, okay? I think it's race, religion, that sort of thing, right? And the people who supported that legislation, what they considered to be in or out was also very clear, right? Like, the African Americans in the 1960s were otherwise fairly conservative people, right? They wanted to have their rights respected. They didn't want to be treated based on their skin color, to be discriminated against for this immutable characteristic. But they didn't have wildly different social views than everyone else, right? They weren't, gay activists or anything, right? And so the law of the land is these characteristics are protected. Okay. The Supreme Court, by majority decision, decided that this covered sexuality and transgender. Okay. Now, reading the legislation, reading the act, it is clear that those things aren't in there. And reading the surrounding legislation, it is clear that no one intended for those things to be in there. It wasn't like an omission of drafting, right? And yet it has been added by the Supreme Court. Now, where I separate the law from the morality, of course those things should be in there. You shouldn't be fired for being gay, full stop, right?
Yeah.
But that's a role of Congress. Congress passes the law to say, I'm going to amend the Civil Rights Act to say homosexuality is now a protected characteristic, right?
Yeah.
That's their responsibility, okay? It's not up for the Supreme Court to rewrite the legislation.
Yeah, how can they do that?
Because they have that constitutional power to interpret the law. They have interpreted the law to say something that it doesn't say, right?
Oh, okay.
And by all precedent, by all, understanding of the English language, it doesn't say that, and the original drafters did not intend for that. So therefore, the Supreme Court, by proper jurisprudence, shouldn't interpret it that way. And yet they have, because they know they can, and they can because the Congress is extremely weak and the presidency is highly controversial. So in these times, the Supreme Court is considered to be really important for those that care mostly about the social fabric of the United States. They see
do people vote for the Supreme Court?
Well, particularly on the Republican side, they do. So, but this time also on the Democratic side. So on the Republican side, there's an old saying, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. And one of the reasons for that is the Republicans will tend to vote for whoever the Republican candidate is and turn out for them because they are more concerned about the Supreme Court than Democrats typically. Because Republicans care about abortion, Republicans care about the Constitution, they care about the traditional Bill of Rights, they care about the Second Amendment. So they care more about these issues typically than the Democrats do, okay? But this year is different. This year, because Donald Trump has nominated two people to the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, okay? And the next term of office will absolutely see a new vacancy. Okay, so there is a very Ginsburg, a very senior Democrat appointed Supreme Court nominee who's idolized by the left of American politics, who's been suffering through cancers and all kinds of other things. She's 80-something years old, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been staying on the Supreme Court, hoping to get through the Trump years so that her successor can be nominated by a Democratic president, okay? And she will not be able to get through another 4 years, right? She's really pushing it. And so if Trump is reelected, she will have to retire, okay, because she won't be able to get to the 2024. And then Trump will be able to nominate the successor. And then he would have nominated 3 Republican members of the Supreme Court. There will be a strong push to have strict originalists, whatever they call them, the people that interpret the law literally, okay? Originalists, I think it is. In terms of like, this is the letter of the law. You're not an activist from the bench. You just say what the law says, right? And there'll be a strong push for that. And so Republicans will turn out to vote because they have a unique opportunity to tip the scales of the Supreme Court firmly in the conservative favor. And the Democrats will turn out to prevent that from happening because they're afraid of abortion being made illegal and things like that in the United States. This year, the Supreme Court will be a more prominent fixture. Number one, because it's more powerful than it has been historically because of the weaknesses of the other branches of government. And two, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a strong Democratic kind of left-wing voice on the bench, she will be absolutely made to retire. Maybe even another person will have to go as well at some point. The Republican appointees are younger as a rule at the moment. So the Democrats have a lot more to lose. So they'll be more motivated to vote for that basis. But will your average Democratic voter who can't see anything of themselves in Joe Biden at all go out and vote for the Democrats? Probably not. Whereas Republicans who hate Donald Trump will go out and vote for the Supreme Court. Like it's a difference in mentality that has been a big advantage to Republicans across the board.
Yeah. Crispin, why don't we have younger leaders elected? Because again, so Joe Biden's 77 years old, and where are the Andrew Yangs and whatnot?
Yeah, well, great question. So Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang should be the next president, vice president in whatever order of the United States. If they did that, country would be better off. Trump probably wouldn't even run against Tulsi, to be frank. He'd be probably too worried that he's going to lose. But the Democratic Party is imploding, is insane. And the only way, when you have a really contested environment, then going for an older, malleable leader that everyone's kind of familiar with and isn't too offensive to different factions is a safe pair of hands perceived to be, right? So this is more about internals to the Democratic Party than it is about what the Americans are voting for.
It does send a message that there are problems within this party.
It does. And also that in the case of younger people, when it's going to be very hard for Joe Biden to get these people to come out and vote for him. So Democrats have relied on the youth vote quite a bit for many, many years, right? Because older people tend to vote Republican, younger people tend to vote Democrat. Now, there is an advantage for Joe Biden in that he is kind of popular among some older Trump voters. And so he may be able to swing some votes in those important swing states based on people who would normally come out and vote just out of force of habit and may then vote for Biden as opposed to Trump. So that is actually a slight advantage for Biden, but he's not going to get younger people out to the polls. Like, he just is not. Whereas young Trump voters, of which they do exist, are absolutely going to go out and brave COVID to vote for Trump, like, for sure. So that's it's a big question, and also Biden is starting to lose some of the voters that he's traditionally popular with. So one of the main reason he was so successful in his comeback for the Democratic primaries, because he was quite popular with black voters, right? So in the Democratic primaries, the black constituency is much more important than it is in the general election because they're disproportionately within the Democratic Party and they vote in Democratic primaries. And yet Biden is just in the most ham-fisted way. He said in an interview the other day, did you know that unlike the black community, the Latino community is quite diverse? I'm like, what? Yeah, it's like, and then there had to be like this clarification on Twitter, like this multiple like thing of like, yes, I said this, but what I really meant was X, Y, Z. And everyone was responding like, thank you, Biden's carers, for that clarification. Like, because clearly he didn't write that tweet. So Biden is someone who just makes a fool of himself. And he's too old. He doesn't have the mental faculties. He never did, really. Like, I want to say he never did. He was, during the Obama years, he was always the gaffe-prone uncle, right? He was always that guy that you wouldn't trust. Like, he's someone that was a good sounding board for the president, right? He was good for Obama as a confidant and as a friend, but wasn't someone that was you'd let out in public much, right? Because he's always been gaffe-prone, but now he's gaffe-prone and mentally in trouble. And as Joe Rogan said, who's very much a straight talker, said, look, vote Democrat my whole life, but this is a massive gaslight to the American people. That the Democrats are telling everyone that A, Joe Biden is the best option they could throw up, and B, everyone can see that he has mental issues, right? That is in a mental decline, and how can you ask him to be president, right?
Because as president, you are the most powerful person in the world. Like, you are the leader, and we want to be led by a capable leader, right?
Yeah, well, this is the weird thing, and this is the problem on both sides. Trump is someone who has very clear, strong opinions and ideas in the way he wants the country to run, but doesn't have people around him to execute it because they try and manage the president rather than follow his instructions, and we see case after case of that. Whereas Biden has the opposite problem. He's a vacuous, safe pair of hands that allows the people around him to run riot. And neither one of those is really well suited to this particular era. So Trump was kind of a zeitgeist for 2016 when there was something really deeply wrong in the equity of the American contract. We had this hollowing out of the American middle class, all wealth going to the top 1%. And Trump saying clearly to the average American voter, you've been left behind, you've been neglected, you've been taken advantage of. I'm going to bring those jobs back to the United States. I'm going to renegotiate those trade deals. I'm going to make sure that you're not forgotten anymore. And that was a very powerful message in 2016. Where Trump has not excelled is in the crisis management space, right? Like the commander in chief kind of aspect of the presidency. He's a confidence player, so he's really good. Like if there's a hurricane or something comes through, to put on the jacket and go out and pat all the relief workers and stuff on the shoulder and give them a pep talk and hand out care packages and things like that. He's great at that stuff. He's great at that stuff, but he is not a great thing is like, okay, we've got this massive crisis that requires coordination across agencies and jurisdiction, cooperation between federal and state and all of this stuff. And the rapid distribution of resources. He's just not that guy, okay? And so he does have a good message for what it means to be American, what Americans care about. He's a reflection of their concerns, but he's more of a symbol rather than a president, okay? Yeah. He's a head of state, if you know what I mean.
What makes a good president?
Judgment.
Judgment.
Yeah, it's what makes a good politician. Judgment. This is one of the big fallacies of
a good leader. Yeah.
Yeah. So most people think that it's intellect, like the ability to think through issues and come up with effective policy solutions. And as a public servant and government official, I know that most kind of technocratic public officials think that way. They think, why can't they be, super experts on these subjects like us? No. It's about understanding the art of the possible and having faith in good people, right? So I'll give you an example in the Australian context. Malcolm Turnbull is often thought to be a highly intelligent, articulate individual. Just ask him, right?
Okay.
But he has terrible political judgment, right? He allowed John Howard because he led the Republican referendum on the yes side in the 1999 referendum. He allowed John Howard to absolutely skewer him by dividing the yes vote into two different camps in the most easy way possible. He then, as opposition leader, thought that he could bring down Kevin Rudd, a popular prime minister at that time, over a used ute, Godwin Gretsch. It might have been before your time, but it got him kicked out as leader, and that's how Tony Abbott became leader of the opposition leader and then later prime minister. He thought that when he did knife Tony Abbott, he wouldn't have to do anything as prime minister, that he would just be so beloved that when the election came around, he'd be re-elected with a large majority and therefore would be able to move the party in his direction without ever having made any actual policy changes. So he instead having done nothing, lost his majority and became a greatly weakened figure, completely undermining the reason why he supposedly replaced Tony Abbott in the first place. He never reached out effectively to the right wing of his own party. So he has a conservative wing of the Liberal Party that he couldn't ever bring on board. And so he just had this perpetual, perennial bad political judgment. So no matter what his IQ is, right, he just did not have the political acumen to read the room, right? And this is true for Obama in many cases. No one would ever accuse Obama of being intellectually deficient, right? He's a law professor, clearly, one of the best, rhetorical speakers in American history, right? Some profoundly, I still remember his Greater Union speech during the campaign. Beautiful words, right? Heartfelt as well, but he has this very low level of neuroticism, almost to a fault, where he just seems like he's lecturing you all the time, right? And and his policies were a perennial failure. His pivot to Asia didn't work. His reset with Russia didn't work. His relationship with Iran didn't work. His intervention in Libya didn't work. Like, he just is the worst president in terms of actually delivering results, right? And that's because he didn't actually understand the art of the possible. He thought that America had lost its way under George W. Bush and would reset it as be a sort of a cosmopolitan world citizen without taking the American people on that journey or reminding Americans why they were actually positive and special, right? So his legacy was just torn up as soon as he was voted out of office, right? Like, he couldn't hand it off to Hillary Clinton, and that was another misjudgment on his part. So so judgment is the most important characteristic of a political leader, and including.
How do people strengthen their judgment?
Sorry,
how do people strengthen their judgment?
How do you? Whoa.
Is that a?
Well, the problem is there are countervailing forces. Okay, so at some point, every person who becomes president of the United States has to look in the mirror and say, who would be the best person to lead the free world? This guy or this girl, right? Right. There's a certain intrinsic narcissism that is required in order to run for the presidency.
Yeah.
Okay. But there is there's a sort of you need to separate that somehow with being able to take in and appreciate the unique talents of others. Okay, what is often said about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a very successful president, both electorally and also in bringing his country to war and successfully concluding it, he was considered to have a second-rate intellect and a first-rate judgment, that he understood the mood of the American electorate. He understood what he could lead on and what he could follow on. He understood the power balances in the Congress. He understood the various power brokers. He could work a room, and he could appoint people that made up for his deficiency. So it requires a certain level of self-awareness. Like, what are you bad at? How do you get people to do the best for you? It's judgment is a terribly difficult and fraught thing. I mean, there's I know I keep coming back to it, but one of the people with the best political judgment was Marcus Aurelius, and he was a Stoic philosopher. So I'll just throw that in there as a bone of contention. But it's hard to develop. What you need to do is humble yourself in a way to take in a lot of information. And to be able to be a good analyst, and to have trusted advisors who the advisors can't be people pushing their own agenda. Okay, this is the problem that Trump has, right? Trump has been surrounded by people who work to manage him, to make him a more moderate figure, if you like. He hasn't had competent people who want to carry out his policies, right? So he's the duly elected president of the United States, and he has a foreign policy agenda of America first, right? Allies have to pay their fair share. interests over values, America reorienting towards China, reasserting its place in the world, right? Now, whether you agree or disagree with that, if you're appointed by the President of the United States, your job is to faithfully and to the best of your ability, as if it was your own policy, implement that policy and to give the President options to enable him to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he hasn't been appointing people that can do that, right? He appoints people either who have a long history and understand Washington really well, but don't want things to change and aren't on board with his agenda and therefore undermine it, or he appoints people that are with him on his agenda but have no understanding of how things work in Washington and just make fools of themselves, right? So Trump, he's great at getting elected, but he has much less impact in terms of effectively implementing change within the Washington establishment. He's done well in terms of the party. The party has shifted, and he's done well with China in terms of getting the American politic to focus on that. But in terms of his other stuff, in terms of like the border walls and things like that, he's got nowhere, absolutely nowhere.
Wow. Yeah. I only wanted to ask that because I was thinking to myself, how do we foster capable leaders? Yeah. So I don't know. I think some food for thought.
That's a difficult question. How do we identify and nurture capable leaders?
Like even just broadly, because I think yes, like being president of the United States is a huge responsibility, but even every day as well. Because I think that the skill of judgment, can transcend through everyday life.
Well, the presidency, there is something that the American system does well, which is really test a candidate, right? They're hiding Biden for as long as they can. But typically speaking, the grueling marathon nature of a presidential campaign, which starts 2 years before the election, you have to get the donors, you have to get the presidential primaries, you have to get votes for your own party, then you have to go campaign at a national level. Then
it's actually crazy.
Well, that's staying power, right?
Okay.
That shows that no matter what people throw at you, you can keep going, right? So there is a certain set of characteristics that weed out people who are unsuited to the rigors of a presidential cycle. Okay, so that's good. That is one positive about the American system. There are many bad things about the American system, but at the very least, it tends to throw up presidents who can campaign for long periods of time. Right, can actually stick with something. But in the first instance, the first thing to do is to encourage people to want to go into politics. I mean, this is the first malaise, right? Like people look at politics, the broken system of politics, the abject misallocation of power, the fraudulent and corrupt practices, the distinction and separation of the elites from ordinary people. The looking down of the electorate among certain segments of polite society, and the dirty game of politics. And so really good people who have great ideas, great leadership skills, able to inspire others, choose other fields. Life is too short for most people to go into politics, right? Because it tends to infect people.
It's aggressive. It's a game. Like you really have to play the game of politics. It's not something that you can learn from a book.
Well, there's a lot of things you can't learn from the book. I mean, the politics is how power is distributed. That's politics, right? And so if you like power, then politics is a game you want to learn. But I mean, I'm a Machiavelli devotee. Like I think that power is amoral, as in it is distinct from morality, and people who gain power do not gain power because they're moral people, but because they're effective in accumulating power. And the ability to accumulate power is itself given it's a contested, competitive environment, is some measure of being able to effectively wield it, right? Now, it's not to in any way say that you'll wield it virtuously, but there's a certain, if you have to become a democratically elected leader, you have to learn something about politics. It's different if you're, say, an inherited monarch, right? Like you're just born into it. And no matter what you do, you've got like this power, then that divorces it from the skills necessary to get, coalitions of people and to work with others and so on that often politicians do need. I think it's much easier to answer the question, how do we make effective politicians, than it is to answer the more important question, which is, how do we get better leaders? That's unknown. We have to change the incentives in order to attract people who are better people into the realm of politics and to allow them to thrive.
Okay. Heavy. That's interesting. Okay, let's just go. I wanted to.
But I will say something positive though, right? That the vast majority. See, we have this perception that politicians are terrible and it's all corrupt and blah blah blah. That's actually not true, right? A large majority of politicians that I know, have dealt with over many years, both professionally and privately, are very intelligent, committed, public service-driven individuals who really do want the best for everyone around them. They deal with an imperfect system, but most of them do have a strong public service orientation. They're just not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily come through all of the time. If I did talk to politicians privately, they almost always just want what's best, right? And that's actually a really good thing to see. So don't think it's all bad. It's not. The system is troubled, but the people involved do enter politics, generally speaking, because and often they know the problems, right? And they do it with their eyes open, and yet they still do it, often from a public service motivation.
Yeah. What do you say to people that want to engage more into politics but find it very intimidating?
Do it.
Just do it.
Yeah. Well, look, as I said in my top 5 tips on how to influence, the world is run by the people who show up, right? If when someone says someone should do something, you're someone, right? Like you have agency to get involved and make a change, right? Like, and if you have ideas and you're driven and you want to see something happen, Twitter is made for people that
to complain,
to be impotent, right? And as Gough Whitlam once said, only the impotent are pure. Okay, if you want to not compromise, if you want to not deal with other people, if all you want to do is vent, then yes, there are social media outlets for that purpose. But if you want to actually make the world a better place for people, and you're willing to be open, I mean, that's the other thing that a feature of a good politician is to be open to people, right? Like if you don't have all the answers, okay? You're not the smartest person in the world. And even if you were, you don't have the accumulated ability of everyone else, right? You do need perspectives and information from others that you don't otherwise have, okay? And successful politicians are able to take the interests of different stakeholders and weigh them and come up with a good solution, even if the solution is imperfect from a technocratic perspective, it's the solution that does the most for the largest number of people.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so get involved in politics. It's actually a good thing to do. It might be intimidating, and yes, politics is amoral, but that doesn't mean you have to be. You can get in and make a change.
Yeah. Cool. So. We also talked this week, or you talked this week, about the race of AI between China and the USA.
Yeah.
Now, what really stood out to me was just how advanced AI has become, and it is basically going to be the next weapon, and determine basically the power of the free world. And my question is, considering AI is so advanced, it's going to really concentrate wealth. And how do you think AI is going to determine how wealth is distributed?
Well, very narrowly. I mean, as I said in the previous video, we already have a emerging IQ elite where wealth is concentrated in the hands of the people that have the skills to develop scalable industries. Okay. So it means, if you go back to ages past where the vast majority of people were in subsistence agriculture, yes, intelligence may help in certain planning of crops and things, but strength and, all ruggedness, all of this stuff were equally important, if not more. And so a variety of personal characteristics would determine one's individual wealth and well-being, right? Whereas now the global economy is controlled by people who can write the right code and people who can set up effective supply chains and manipulate markets and things like that. Those are typically high IQ areas, right? And other characteristics are now less important, right? Now, if you have an AI system that can say, for example, analyze the stock market, right, and work out based on a variety of assumptions when to buy and sell shares, then someone's individual wealth can be determined by a self-learning machine that runs through trillions of scenarios as to how to invest, when to buy and sell to maximize profit. Well, whoever controls that AI system is going to be very rich indeed. Okay. If you have, urban planning, also the other thing that people don't realize is what professions are going to be replaced by AI. So let's say you have, and people think it's like, low end stuff, things that have already been replaced by machines.
Checkout chicks.
Yes, that sort of stuff. Car manufacturing, or it's not perhaps self-driving cars, the Uber drivers and so on. All of those people will be affected, but it's not that. It's the doctors, it's the lawyers, it's the accountants that are going to be wiped out by AI. So, for example, let's say you have a system, you give it just verbal recognition of your symptoms, okay, and a system that has instant access to the world's accumulated body of knowledge of medical research, right? And by cross-referencing your case and your personal characteristics instantaneously across billions of different health profiles across the world, running trillions of different scenarios and prognoses of different treatment options, different diagnoses, methods, and so forth, you will have a medical AI system that will give you absolutely the best diagnosis that has ever been given by any medical professional before, the most effective treatment for that particular ailment, and various plans for eating and dieting and all this sort of stuff, because they go, okay, people who eat, because it won't even have to just reference that database. You could say, okay, well, what percentage of people who buy lots of pasta at the Woolworths checkout end up developing certain types of cancer, and how does that relate to your current, problem with your colon? These are things that AI systems will be able to do immediately, right? Doctors will be redundant. Okay, now, good and bad, right? You're going to be a lot healthier. Okay, that's not AI systems will be like, yeah, I can treat you, right? Whereas not so good if you want to be a doctor, Yeah. Now, there'll be some things that obviously, humans will still be required for in personal care, but still, like that.
Would AI be able to replace lawyers?
Absolutely. I mean,
are you sure?
Look, don't get your hopes up too much. It's true that there'll still be lawyers. There's always lawyers. There's tax desks and lawyers, but but No, there will definitely be better than any lawyer. I mean, most of what lawyers do is research legal precedents, right? And apply kind of like very few lawyers get up and stand in front of a courtroom very often at all. It's always a time, even those that do, it's a small fraction of the work that they do. The vast majority are there doing research and writing up contracts and things like that. All of that's going to be done by an AI system. Like, the AI will instantly know what the most common form of breakdown of dispute in this particular contract type is, and therefore what the most effective means of provision to minimize any misunderstanding between parties. Boom, it's done, right? Like these are things that AI will do effortlessly.
What about childcare?
Well, that's where AI systems do fall down, which is the personal care. So things that aren't scalable. Right?
Okay.
So raising a child, there's question marks over psychology. So an AI system may know the most effective means of treatment in terms of particular, personality disorders and things like that. But the AI system probably doesn't have the mechanisms by which it can apply that in a care plan. So in those instances, AI will be more a service for psychologists, therapists, those sorts of things, than a replacement of, right?
Okay.
So there'll be some areas that will still be around for a long time, but many GPs, for example, can easily be replaced. I mean, imagine you just have on your phone a doctor that is better than any human has ever been as a medical GP that you have instant access to all the time. And you might even start wiring up your own monitoring devices. So already you have these devices that tell people their steps and their heart rates and things like that. We just do that with your phone. The phone is connected to an AI, which just constantly monitors and says, okay, well, I've detected these slight changes in your biorhythms. You should know that in 12.9% of cases when similar biorhythms occur, we notice a correlation with a particular form of mental degeneration in 15 to 20 years' time. So in order to avoid that, I recommend you increasing your diet of broccoli by 25.6% in order to,
This sounds like a Black Mirror episode.
But this is all, none of what I am saying. I mean, we're already seeing this in, the problem is and going back to your economic question, the problem is the perverted incentives, right? So right now, some of the major supermarket chains in Australia are getting into insurance, okay? And without a hint of irony, the CEO of one of these chains got up and said, yeah, well, we can see all kinds of correlations with what people eat and how likely they are to have a car accident, right? So that means that we'll be able to give people discounts on their premiums if they're eating, a certain type of food, right? Like this is real stuff. Okay. Now at the moment, AI is much more common in terms of getting people advertising and things like that. So the things that are kind of just making the dollars. And in the case of national countries, it's who's going to win the war. But in terms of daily life, it will become an augmentation. The real breakthrough in AI, and I mean this is not a general AI, but still narrow AI, but in self-learning, is one that can replace your partner. As in, like, you create an AI system that is so well adapted to your personal sense of need, emotionally, psychologically, that your confidant is basically an AI. The movie Her, I don't know if you've seen it. It's Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson. And what happens is there's this new operating system that is created, and it's set 10 years in the future, right? So not too far in the future. Joaquin, he's the main character. He downloads this new operating system. The operating system asks him some questions like, what was your relationship with your mother, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, this voice appears in his room because it's taken over all of these electronic equipment that's everywhere. And it's the voice of Scarlett Johansson, and they develop this relationship. Anyway, he falls in love with his operating system, right? And then the other people around the world start falling in love with their operating systems. And then some people start having affairs with operating systems that aren't even theirs and so on. And anyway, I won't give away the story.
So he falls in love with this smart home.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's believable. This is the weird thing. You watch it and you're like, this is actually... understand like this is a direction that I'm sure a lot of AI programmers would like to go in. I mean, I'm sure
destroy all human relationships and
well no, but I mean, look, let's face it, if you're an AI programmer, right, and you spend your life programming AI, well, you probably do want to create a partner. I mean, let's be real, like it'd be kind of cool. And I don't think it will replace all relationships, but it does. There is a failed promise in technology and when it comes to finding relationships. And I had a conversation online about this the other day. This is slightly away from the AI, but on the same wavelength, where there was I'm of an age where, and I mentioned this last time. Where dating online was still a bit weird when it first arose. And I was reflecting now with these other people, has there been a shift? And there has been. So electronic dating apps and the like held out a promise, okay? And the promise was that you would be able to find people more compatible with yourself in a more efficient way. Right, because you would be able to match up characteristics and preferences and outlooks and values and things and types that you like, and people would just match up much more quickly, and you wouldn't have to go through this, incredibly inefficient courtship process that would end you up with a less than ideal match. Right, that was the promise of it all, and that's what got people excited. It didn't turn out that way because the way in which people find their partners through these apps, I'm not saying each individual case, I'm talking aggregate. By and large, the actual courtship process is one of the things that tests compatibility rather than just a swipe. You know what I mean? Like having someone approach you in the right way, to develop that chemistry, a sense of the package of characteristics, and to have space to be surprised, because one of the things about falling in love, etc., is you don't control that, right? And therefore you do rely on your subconscious a bit when it comes to these things, and to trust in things beyond your own kind of intellectual what you would choose per se. Before the choice is made, right? So it does create a more shallow version of romance and the importance of it. I mean, I gave someone some flowers as a condolence, right? And it was misinterpreted. This was a long time ago. It was misinterpreted, and I reflected on why it was misinterpreted, because in my mind it was clear why it was happening, right? Like it was something bad had happened to them, and flowers were a nice condolence, and these flowers are not in any way like red roses or anything like that. These were like standard flowers. Okay. And I don't think, because this person was a fair bit younger, I don't think it would have been interpreted that way by someone older. Right, like it would have been interpreted in the more classic, oh, you're upset, here's something to cheer you up, right? Because in the, like, I can't imagine. Now, maybe, see, here's the thing, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm wrong, because I do have a really classic sense of this. I know we've jumped topic from AI quite a bit.
Yeah. I was like, can AI send you flowers?
AI might know when you need them. That's the thing. Right?
That's why I was reflecting. Sorry, do you want to finish your story?
Yeah, I do, because I don't know if I'll ever come back to it. So I was reflecting on this, and I do have a really classic approach to courtship. Like, if it doesn't take months of work to think about what gift you're giving, don't give a gift, right? Like, it's like if you are if you're going to get someone a lump of decapitated foliage as a gift, right?
Okay.
You don't deserve to be in a relationship. You know, like, it's kind of so. When I was shocked that it had been interpreted that way, because in my head I would never have been so bland about this, right? Like, I would have gone to extraordinary lengths to find exactly the right thing if that had been my intention, which it wasn't. But like yeah, so but AI, I will bring it back to AI. AI will not make that mistake. AI will know me, right? And here's the weird thing, AI might be the best wingman ever, right? Well, no, think about it, because you go, all right, I like this person, let's say, and it will do two things. It will work out how you would approach this, and that it will work out how the other person is most likely to receive it. So these miscommunications won't happen, right? And let's say I have a preference for a gift. Let's say that's my thing. I'm going to give someone a gift. Well, the AI system will be able to synthesize pretty much everything about that person instantaneously, copy them with all like-minded people across the world, synthesize all of the different types of objects and items and things that might be appealing to that person, see, from various other relationship types, when those things were actually given initially and its success rate, and then come up with something. And say, okay, what you need to do is to get, this particular ornament from this Balinese gift shop owner, and then give it to your would-be interest, and that will appeal to their childhood, memory of XYZ, and invoke a sense of nostalgia that they subconsciously don't even realize is related to that, and it'll seem like a perfectly natural form of chemistry, and that could be totally effective, right?
I'm gonna be off the grid if that happens.
But I mean, we're already seeing like AI systems compose music, write novels.
I once saw a YouTube video completely done in AI.
Yeah,
like they did a whole story. I think they just uploaded a bunch of movies, and then the AI system made a story out of it. It wasn't very good, but it was a story.
Yeah. I mean, it has a ways to go, right? But 10 years is, I think, it's a perfectly reasonable time frame to get these things pretty good.
And then by that stage, you all live in the Matrix.
Well, we start. Yes, actually, it's a good. Yes, we will have a synthetic augmentation of our reality, where computer systems help us to realize a full sense of potential. Yeah. I mean, I'm not worried really, because
why?
Well, because I'm already disappointed by our society.
I was on Facebook the other day and I saw a post by one of my friends. Basically, you know how people want to voice their frustrations or ideas?
No, not at all.
Like this podcast. But yeah, like it really struck me because, you talked about it. You talked about anti-Semitism, and I didn't realize that even happens in my own social circles, that she was so frustrated by the way strangers were treating her because she was Jewish. Like, they basically was like, oh, there's money on the ground, Poe, pick it up, and just small things. Like, where? Like, I don't understand where this, I don't know, this racial bias against Jewish originates from. Like, I don't understand. Like, they are just people.
Well, obviously, I agree. I mean, my video sort of left that as an open question. I think when it comes to certain aspects of it, because the case that you gave me with the sort of the Jewish quip, if you like, Jews do make really good comedians as a rule, right? Like, I'm obviously generalizing, but prominent comedians in the United States are Jewish. There's every actor in Seinfeld was Jewish. Jon Stewart, Jewish. Just like it's a common trope almost to have the stand-up comedian as a Jewish person. And so, unlike a lot of other groups, people can make jokes about Jews in a way that they can't make jokes about black people, stuff like that, in polite society, right? So when I was at uni, there was a Jewish community kind of group, and we would get together and just make Jewish jokes all the time, obviously with the Jews themselves. Jews, as a rule, have a certain sense of grace in not taking themselves too seriously, right? And that has allowed people to make jokes at their expense that they make themselves as Jews, which can very easily go from unbelievable comedy to abject cruelty, right? And that's a fine line that people don't really seem to understand, okay? And so if you're a Jewish person that's subject to these jokes all the time, may not be able to make that distinction very easily, and the people making those jokes may not have the boundaries in place to make it acceptable, right? So I make these Jewish jokes with my Jewish friends, right? Like, and they're jokes with them, not at them, right? And that is a product of their testament and the sense of humor, okay? But it's not something I would do with a stranger, you know, and it's not something that I would do as a way to humiliate or embarrass or shame, right? And not everyone does that. So it is, you know, a lot of jokes based on race and ethnicity and so on are no longer acceptable in kind of normal conversation, right? And that avoids that problem generally. Okay, so a lot of racial epithets, you know, like we can say those things if we've known a friend for 30 years and they refer to themselves that way and they expect you to refer to them that way, and that shows you're close. You can call them all kinds of horrible things, right? For all kinds of characteristics, nothing necessarily to do with their appearance, right? And that's a sign of closeness. Whereas in the Jewish space, you can make jokes that with a degree of permissiveness. Like there's only a couple of other cases like that. You can make jokes, for example, about gingers, like people with ginger hair, that, you know, a lot of people might think are mean, but they're still kind of accepted.
I never understood the whole joke with like gingers have no soul. I don't understand. Where does that come from? Like, I don't.
Oh my God, we're going to kick it off YouTube.
We will, yeah. No, I'm serious. Like, that's just. You're laughing, but I'm confused.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, you need to be able to laugh at stuff, but you also need to be nice, you know. And I mean, there's the other one is the Irish and the potatoes. Like, obviously, those jokes still happen, like in cartoons and stuff like that. Like Archer, you know, like they all have those jokes. And you can say that to Irish people, and they'll tend to laugh, you know. So often it's on the recipient side as to what's acceptable and what isn't. And therefore, some of these things have changed to different rates as a rule. And I'm of the belief, personally, that it is a matter of the intent and the expression, right? Like if everyone involved knows that the intent is lighthearted and that, you know, the care is not taken to wound, you know, then it's okay, right? Then you can have a laugh, and we shouldn't pathologize humor necessarily, but we shouldn't also create an environment where things that are unacceptable are let go.
Yeah.
You know, on the basis that people can't take a joke. etc. Like it's a fine line. You don't want to suppress natural kind of connection. Like if you're in difficult, like one of the ways of bonding is to be able to tease and to kind of accept that and kind of, that's part, particularly among men, a part of the process, right? You need that. You can't have you need a safe space to do that, right? But you also can't create an environment where the darker side of that comes out. So I can understand your friend's worry, right? Because it is very permissive to tease Jews, and like I do it myself, but in a controlled environment with the right people and the right circumstances, right? It's not something I just do willy-nilly, and I do it with the best affection, right? But that's not going to be true for everyone who receives it, and that's one of the reasons why you have to be so damn careful with it, because it's not a safe thing to do.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think that's why. I think, when you make jokes about others, like it's better if you're with people that you know, and it's not good to make a joke over the internet because there's no tone or context, so like it gets muddy. But I don't know. You can have a good laugh at me about Asian jokes. I'm fine. I'm a self-proclaimed banana, so it's Do you know what it means?
No, I don't.
Oh, so like, because banana's like yellow on the outside, it's like, but I'm like white on the inside.
Okay, we're leaving that in.
Well, no, like seriously, and it's so bad, right? Because in Australia, I sometimes feel too Asian to be Australian. But when I go back to Malaysia, where my family is, I'm too Australian to be Malaysian.
Oh, you're Australian.
Oh yeah, that's what I thought.
Australian, except when it comes to food. Then it's like, no, you must not waste that food. But it tastes shame.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have. He's gonna make a mockery of me.
All right. Everyone, be well. Be good to each other. Don't tease each other on the internet. And hopefully you found value in this conversation. If you did.
Yeah, please like and subscribe and leave any comments down below. We're happy to address them, answer any questions and whatnot. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.